Okay, so I'm just waiting for the stream to kick off on my other monitor here so I can make sure that everything is working. Let me know if anyone can't hear me or anything weird like that. But yeah, otherwise, I'll just kind of get into it and talk a little bit about what I'm planning to do here. So one of the things that I've been working on for the last several weeks, which has been driving me insane, is for Tailwind 1.0, I want to rework the config file format a little bit because it's kind of carrying some legacy baggage with it, and I think we would have constructed it differently had we sort of known what features we were going to be adding later and stuff like that. So briefly explain, maybe, if you look at the current Tailwind config file, all the top level keys are things like stuff related to your styles, like your colors, your screens, your fonts, your text sizes, your font weights, and stuff like that. And at the beginning, that was the only stuff that we really even had in Tailwind's config file. It was just stuff related to like your design system. And then eventually we added like this other options key at the bottom for doing like more advanced options. We added this plugins key. We added this modules key to sort of customize the variants or disable different modules built into Tailwind. And after adding all this stuff, it sort of felt weird that all these other keys related to styling were top level in the config file, sort of siblings with some of these settings that were more like configuration for Tailwind, the plugin, and less stuff related to sort of your site's look. So I've been working on this for like 3 weeks, trying different config formats and different ideas and stuff, and figuring out how I would have wanted this to look in hindsight had I known what sort of stuff we'd be adding. And I came up with something. Let me see if I have it. Basically, the idea is that, and this is also based on a conversation I had with a few people, notably Jason McCreary kind of helped me crack this a little bit and come up with a firm decision, is that in Tailwind 1.0, I want to encourage people to use the default styles more than we have in the past. And I think up until now, most people already are using the default styles, and they'll maybe jump into their Tailwind config and add a couple margin settings or change the colors or whatever. But we've always sort of published the entire config file for you. And if there was stuff that you didn't want to change, it just sat there in your config file, which is fine, but we were sort of giving you ownership of stuff that, by the sounds of it, based on some of these conversations I've had with people, not everyone wants to own that stuff. They kind of want to rely on Tailwind's defaults and trust that we've made good decisions about things, and only sort of change stuff here and there, except for things like fonts and colors, which are things that people tend to override more commonly. So what I'm working on now is, instead of publishing the entire config file for people to sort of edit, I'm going to try and encourage a workflow where basically you start with a config file that's basically like empty, that looks more like this. And when you want to change like your colors or something, you drop down into this new theme key, which is where I'm moving all of the top level keys that used to exist. And you could just do something like, if you wanted to add a new color, you know, you could say colors should be equal to sort of blend in the colors from the default theme, and then maybe you want an extra color like salmon or something. And you could add as many of these colors as you wanted to. Or similarly, if you wanted to override the font stack, you would just override the font stack. If you want to extend the font stack, you know, you would just splat in the existing fonts before you added your own stack, you know? Something like this. So the idea is going to be, at the end of the day, your Tailwind config file is going to be like a quick place to reference your overrides and changes, as opposed to being able to reference the entire system. And I was a little bit worried about that at first, because I think there's quite a few people who use their config file as sort of a reference for seeing what classes exist and stuff like that. But then it occurred to me that there's a bunch of classes in Tailwind that aren't in the config file no matter what. Like, for example, if you look at like the stuff for overflow, there's no overflow stuff on your config file. So if you didn't have these classes memorized, you were already sort of forced to jump to the documentation to learn about what they are anyways. So instead of having people depending on their config file for certain values and the documentation for other class values, my goal is basically to just make people rely on the documentation for the default stuff, and that their config file should just be the source of truth for their overrides or extensions. And I think it'll be pretty interesting because I think it'll keep the config file a lot simpler. Like, I explored so many options where we were going to have like a whole folder where we published different files for you, or like even this version where we had a separate file for every single built-in plugin. It was just going to be insanity. It seemed like a good idea conceptually, but I think it would have made it really overwhelming for people to add Tailwind to their project and feel like, holy crap, it just created like 100 files. Like, get this out of here. I don't want to commit to this sort of thing. So yeah, that's sort of the backstory, working on making this thing simpler. I started kind of working on the actual code for reworking the config file last night. And I left myself with a big to-do list of different things that I need to implement, whether it's writing tests for things or adding little features to it and stuff like that. So I was going to work on this morning anyways, and I haven't done a live stream in a long time, and I thought maybe it would be fun to just sort of do a live stream where you can just watch me work on this stuff if you're interested. So it's going to be a little bit different than my normal live streams where, you know, maybe we're rebuilding something in Tailwind and it's sort of really meant to be more like a tutorial style format or something like that. This is really just, I'm going to be working and the camera is going to be rolling and I'll be kind of talking through what I'm doing. So hopefully it's interesting if you just kind of want a behind the scenes look at what it looks like to work on this tool. And yeah, we'll kind of see where it goes. So this is where the config file is at right now in Tailwind itself. So I've refactored it to have all those things that used to be under options are now at the top level. There's this new theme key, and then all of the stuff that used to be just at the top level is nested under this theme key, but it's all still sort of in line. And this is sort of the default configuration that anything would extend. I've renamed the modules key to variants because I think that's a little bit clearer. And instead of making it so you could do like border collapse false to disable like the border collapse module, what I've decided to do is I've added this new key called core plugins that won't be exposed intentionally or explicitly. Instead, this will be like one of those keys that's in the documentation where if you're one of the 0.1% of people who want to completely disable some built-in classes in Tailwind, the way that you'll do it will be by adding this core plugins key to your config, listing the plugin, and turning it off. The reason I did this is because one of the things that I'm doing for Tailwind 1.0 is I'm taking our pre-flight styles, which is our sort of base styles, and I'm going to turn that into a plugin as well. So right now, everything in Tailwind has been rewritten internally such that all of our built-in modules are plugins, and they use the exact same plugin format as a third-party plugin. We just kind of load them all by default, so you don't have to like add them all to your plugins list, because that was one option we considered, was the default config file would literally just list every single plugin that Tailwind needs by default in the plugins list. I think it looked stupid, and it didn't do a good job of making it clear what was kind of core Tailwind stuff and what was third-party stuff. And after all these conversations I've had, I've decided, that I feel pretty good about the config file being a representation of your extensions and overrides, and it shouldn't really leak a bunch of stuff about what the defaults are. So all that to say, I want to rewrite our pre-flight styles to be a plugin as well. And if pre-flight is a plugin and you want to disable it, having pre-flight listed here and setting it to false doesn't really make sense, because you can't have like hover versions of pre-flight or something. It just doesn't make any sense at all, because this is meant to be for variants. So that's why I decided, okay, we'll add this extra core plugins thing, and now if you wanted to disable pre-flight, you could just come in here and disable that core plugin. The other thing you're going to be able to do here, which we might get to in this stream, we might not, is because everything is a plugin, everything actually takes its own configuration. Now, internally, Tailwind will sort of fill in these values for you based on what's in your theme and in your variants configuration. But this core plugins object is going to be a way that you can completely override the options being passed to a core plugin if you wanted to. There's no real practical use case for that yet. But I can imagine a world where maybe one day, like for the margin plugin, we add like an optional argument that's like what class name you want to use. So like right now we just use m-5, that sort of thing. Some people might want to use like margin-5 or something. So if you wanted to do advanced configuration of plugins, if we ever wanted to support that, this is sort of a future-proofing mechanism really. If you ever wanted to support that, instead of just relying on the basic theme configuration stuff, you might do something like margin, and then this would be like your options object. So you might say, okay, well, I just want responsive versions of margin. Here's my margin values, you know, like what your scale is. And then for the class name, you know, I want to use margin instead of m or whatever. Or maybe it's a function that receives the current, maybe it receives like the side, like whether it's top, right, bottom, or left, or whatever, and the value, you know, and then here you can just like return whatever you want. So maybe you return a class name of like, you know, like m side, then like dash 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 value, you know, like you would have total control over doing this sort of thing. So sorry, I'm just reading some of the chat here because I haven't really paid attention so far. When the preflight is plugin, would you consider the ordering precedence of display declarations? Yeah. So one other thing that I want to do with Tailwind 1.0 is rework a couple things like what you're talking about with like the Flexbox stuff. So right now, the Flexbox plugin, so if you look at plugins, Flexbox, it's just one plugin that adds a ton of Flexbox related styles, and they're all different CSS properties. So the Flexbox plugin is what adds the display styles, and as well as flex direction, flex wrap, whatever. The display styles themselves don't include the flex declarations, which means that even though hidden is at the end here, it doesn't override flex, because flex is loaded later. So one of the changes I might make is just move both of these into the display module, because even though you probably wouldn't want them if you're don't need Flexbox, the browser support is so good now that I feel like it should just kind of be a standard option for the most part. But yeah, there's other ways that we could solve that precedence problem if we wanted to. But yeah, it's just definitely something that I'm considering solving. So anyways, back to this config file. Yeah, so if you look now, I've got like, we have a pretty decent test suite for Tailwind. And right now, I think everything is passing except for the CLI tests, which, if I remember correctly, I'm skipping for a reason that we're going to solve soon. The main test that we use to kind of verify that Tailwind is working is just this big crazy test called our sanity test, which is just given this CSS input file with preflight components, utilities, and then an example of using some of Tailwind's other features, we just make sure that it generates this output file. So this is kind of our most black box test. And as long as this test passes, I'm pretty confident that Tailwind is working. So I use this kind of to do refactoring at a higher level. And then we have some more like unit level tests for things where I want to drive out specific edge cases and stuff like that. But the sanity test is kind of like the one that tells me, like, you know, at its core, Tailwind is still working. So this is kind of, when I'm just running an individual test and doing a big refactoring, usually this is the one that I'm working on. So why don't we take a look at my little to-do list and just see like what the next thing I wanted to tackle is on this list as we work towards continuing to make this config file stuff work. and we'll just kind of get into it and update some tests and play around with some things and try and get it working. So there's a couple things here. I haven't really decided what order I want to do them in. So this one is update color related plugins to fall back to colors key and theme. So one of the things that I want to do is, right now if you look at the default config file, text colors, background colors, and border colors are all based on this colors object, like your primary colors object, but we map it explicitly in the config file. I want to make it possible for people in their own projects to just add a color and have it automatically get added to the background colors, the text colors, and the border colors, unless they've gone out of their way to override those as well. So this will always take precedence, but if the user doesn't define those keys, then I just want it to inherit everything from colors, because I think that's kind of how most people want it to work. Have you thought about moving the unit test closer to the source? Haven't really thought about it. I don't know. I don't know what you mean by closer. Like, it's just sorted alphabetically, so, and Jest kind of expects this naming convention by default. I have seen some people put like test folders, you know, like a source, CLI tests, lib tests, plugin tests, whatever. But I tend not to like unit test every single one of these things individually. And everything is, the test structure doesn't really map to the code structure. Because I think if you do that, that gets you into a situation where it's hard to change your code structure while still using the same tests, because your tests are kind of mirroring the implementation. So I try to write the tests in a way that are working at a little bit higher level of abstraction, so I have more flexibility to move things around. So in that regard, I kind of like having them split out separately. So yeah, one of the things I want to do is make it so that the colors stuff just automatically inherits. I think this probably isn't the right thing to do next. Maybe what we should do is work on getting the CLI tests passing, which I think will involve doing some of these other three things. So if I head over to the CLI test, right now I have this skipped. So if we just go back and go yarn run jest CLI.test. So we get a failure, and it's a little bit cryptic, but what's happening is it's trying to apply font bold in our, so the CLI test is also kind of running the sanity test in a sense, but not really checking it as explicitly. But it's trying to process this file, and it's blowing up because font bold isn't actually defined. And the reason that it's not defined is because the CLI test is testing that you can use a custom config file. And the custom config file that they use is this one. And this custom config file only specifies like a couple different things here. It doesn't specify all of the defaults, and the defaults aren't being merged. So what we need to do to get this working is make sure that when someone tries to use a custom config file, that ultimately we are just merging their stuff with the underlying defaults. So that's kind of what I have here, I think. So I think if we start with writing tests for auto merging some of the config stuff, that will probably help us out a lot. So I do already have a test for this, and this used to do more, but as part of this refactoring, I made some decisions about having this actually do less, and now I've sort of backtracked on some of those decisions. But some things are going to be different anyways, so I think we can just sort of write it our own way. So this is basically just a unit test for this merge config with defaults function, which right now literally does nothing. It just literally relies on Lodash's defaults. It used to be more complex, and it's going to become more complex again because of how we want to do the merging. So the first thing I want to do is make sure that when someone tries to specify overrides in the theme section, that we actually sort of deep merge this key, at least one level. So right now what's happening is if someone specifies their own theme key, it sort of overrides it entirely. And there's some legacy stuff in here that we can probably fix, but why don't we just start by writing a new test. So why don't we just write a test that says users, I don't want to say users because I need a single quote for grammar and I don't want to change the quotes in the test name. Basically we want to say theme key is merged instead of replaced. So here's like the users config file. So why don't we just change this so they're just providing a theme, and why don't we just have them override the screens, kind of like we're doing here. So if the user is overriding the screens in the theme, and the way that this function works is it doesn't have knowledge of the default config. It's like a more of a pure function, so it accepts the user's config and the default config as arguments. So here we just sort of have to specify our own default config. So we might go through and make this more consistent for each test, but let's just get this first one passing. So let's assume that there was a theme key here that had screens as well, and maybe we'll I think I have like some screens in another test that we can grab. So maybe we'll just start with these. Okay. I wasn't sure what I had copied. Okay, so let's also add like some colors or something, and maybe like one other key like fonts. So if I go to the default config, let's just grab like these colors, and maybe we'll simplify it even more. I like the tests to be like somewhat realistic in terms of like using real keys. Like I could just do foo and bar and stuff like that, it wouldn't matter, but it seems like there's no benefit to doing that, and there are ways that using real data could be beneficial depending on the sorts of changes that we ever made down the road. So I'll also grab this fonts key and we'll just kind of simplify it for the purposes of the test too. So maybe we'll just have sans, and it'll just have like 4 fonts or something, 5 fonts, and we'll just have like a serif and simplify that. Okay, so the idea here is that given this user config and this default config, the output should be the default config, but with the screens replaced by the user's screens. So we'll just replace this assertion, and we'll grab these screens. And we'll just try and run this test. One thing I'd really like to figure out is how to run individual tests directly from Sublime. I'm sure I could actually just make this work the same way I have the PHP unit plugin that I wrote for Sublime, but right now basically I just set this to test only that, and we'll just do yarn run just merge config. Okay. So we expected all this stuff, but didn't get it. Instead, we only got the screen. So basically, it's not doing the merging. So let's just write this then. So we'll probably do it in sort of a naive way and then think about if there's ways to do it in a more elegant way. But basically we just want to take we just want to set the theme object to be equal to the users, or sorry, the theme object to be equal to combining the two, right? So I think the way the defaults works, if I'm not mistaken, is it uses keys from this as defaults if they're missing here. So we kind of want to just do the same thing with the theme value itself. So let's think, like if we wanted to do this in like a really simple way, we could basically say like const config equals this is like a first step, and then we could just procedurally say like config.theme equals defaults user config.theme defaults config.theme, and then we could return the config. I'd like to try and do this in a way where we weren't creating an object and then later mutating it. If we could sort of do it in more of a elegant single transformation, but let's see if this works. Okay, so that works. So all we're really doing here is grabbing all the top level defaults and then kind of going through one by one and overriding the other ones. Okay, so that's honestly probably like good enough of a test for that scenario for me. Defaults deep is going to go too deep, unfortunately. Okay, so we're getting a failure in a different test. Missing top level keys are pulled from the default config. Let's look at that. Missing top level keys are pulled from the default config. So the problem here is that this is sort of has an expectation on theme, and that's not set up here, which is fine. So maybe one thing we'll do here is go through and I think it's only this test actually. So this test is using the terminology of modules, which has sort of been changed. So let's change that anyways. And then we're going to want to make sure that there's a theme config provided here. So let's grab this one and we'll just stick it in here. Man, what's going on with my indentation here? Let's just keep it simple so that we can fit more on the screen. Colors is going to have to move too, so we're going to have to rework some of that stuff, but we're just going to try and get this passing first. Run the tests again. Okay, still have an error. Expected. Did we not update the... This should be removed. Oh, it's a different test. Okay, so let's just make sure that... Okay, so user top level keys override default top level keys. Okay, so here we're going to have the theme again. I think that'll be good. This is not like a great name anymore. It's a little bit, makes it sound like everything is overrided, but it's not. Prefix key overrides default prefix. I think we're just going to want to maybe make multiple test cases for all the top level ones. So in here we'll just override prefix and we'll leave this as false. Here we'll say important overrides default important. So we'll just override it to true and we'll leave the prefix as nothing because that's kind of the default anyways. And we'll update that here too. And then we'll do the same thing for the separator key. Separator key overrides default separator. key binding to delete lines. So if I do, I don't know if this is built into Sublime or if I added it. Let's see. Yeah, it's right here. I have Command-Shift backspace set to delete line. It's kind of weird. Like this is like a built-in macro in Sublime, but this is kind of the code for it. You can also use Command X will cut a whole line, even if you're just in the line. It's kind of neat. Let's change this like a double underscore separator or something. And this should be false. And see, I don't know, kind of did too much at a time there. Okay, so we're okay. So we got 3 tests for like those main top level keys that actually do override completely. Then we've got the theme key is merged. We would test that missing top level keys are pulled from the default config. So we want to write another one that says like the variants are merged. So let's duplicate this test. The variance key is merged instead of replaced. So I'm just going to grab the default config and we'll find the variance section. And maybe I'll just copy a big enough chunk that we can split it up into multiple parts for this test. Okay, so let's copy this and paste it into, I think what we'll probably do too is extract a common default config that's shared. Okay, so we'll leave, maybe we'll put like 5 of these in here or something. Yeah, that seems good. And we'll keep those, use them as the starting point up here, but we'll just change one of them. Like maybe border colors, we'll also add like active. And maybe we don't need responsive background attachment, so maybe we'll just do this. So now our output should be this, basically. So this one's not going to work yet, and once we get this one working, we're going to have to update the other tests to all specify variants by default. What have I done now? Okay, so I messed something up with the screens. What am I looking at? Variance keys merged instead of replaced. Okay. All right, so that's what's appearance doing in there? Responsive, responsive. Not sure why that's showing up in the diff. Oh, okay, never mind. I understand. It's the opposite that's happening. It's showing that they were completely stripped out. Yeah, the user has to know the defaults to override the variants, and I thought about that at first and thought that kind of sucks, but I don't think it's that big of a deal because you'll know which ones you're using. So if you're overriding, if you're saying that I want to add an active variant to border colors, my thinking is that you'll also know that, well, I do want responsive versions of that too, and I want hover versions, and I want focus versions. And if, say you only put active here, you would quickly discover when you needed responsive versions that you would just have to come here and add your responsive ones. And then when you needed hover, you would come here and add your hover, etc. There is a path in the future where we could make this simpler. Like we could figure out a DSL or something to make it so that you didn't have to know it. Like I considered, like, should we have like an extend key or something where anything that you put in here, anything outside of the extend key is a full replace, but anything in the extend key is like a merge. So we could do something like that. But the nice thing is, like, this is sort of an iterative step, right? We're not like shooting ourselves in the foot really by doing this. We can always add an ability to make that experience simpler later. Okay, so let's run this again and make sure that, yeah, we're still in a spot where the failure is what I expected. So let's head over to this file, and this is just going to be exactly the same as what we have for theme, but for variants. So this is going to make, let's start by just running the test that we're actually working on. Make sure that this gets this test passing, but I'm pretty sure it's going to cause the other tests to fail because we're going to be adding a variance key that doesn't exist anywhere else otherwise. So this is where we're going to find ourselves in a situation where all of the defaults, let's just do like maybe something like this. We're basically going to need to specify some variance for every single default config, which isn't the worst thing ever. I mean, it is like representative of how it actually works, but it's a little bit noisy when you're only worried about like the separator key, for example. So what we might do is, I don't know if I'll actually bother, but it'd be kind of nice if we had some sort of helper where I could create a default config that was like default config and merged in any overrides for the default config. So I might explicitly say, okay, well, our default separator is this. And then I could write a test or an assertion that checks that only that changed and that the rest of the default config stayed the same. I don't know. Maybe it's worth it. Maybe it's not. It's probably not right now. Okay, so we need a variance key for this one. And I guess I should be updating all the assertions too, which I don't think I was. Yep. So this one needs an assertion. This one does too. I don't know. Let's just see where we're at. It's the nice thing about tests. Okay, so we're good now. So even the last test is good? Oh, because it already had an empty variance key. Missing top level keys are pulled from the default config. This test probably needs us to think about it a bit anyways. So this one was basically saying that if someone doesn't provide a key, it is provided by Tailwind. So I almost feel like we could just say that the user's config is empty. The default config, let's put in like the real variance maybe. And maybe we'll put in real defaults for this stuff too. Again, just to make it as representative of the actual config file as possible. This colors thing, we're gonna have to, that lives in the theme now. I just want to get this passing as is, and then we'll think about, we'll look through the other tests and see if that's in the wrong spot and think through if there's any consequences of that. We probably want to have a plugins key too, but let's just see if this is passing and then we can think about that. Okay, so that's good now. Let's look for colors in this file. Okay, so it looks like the top level colors key only appears here. Okay, so let's just move this down here, I guess, whatever. And we'll do the same thing here. And I think that's probably all we need to worry about. Okay, so let's run the whole test suite. Nice. So the interesting thing, right, is before we made these changes, the CLI test was failing. So if we were to go here and just duplicate this line and return this, if we were to run yarn run jest CLI test, this is failing because of that apply font bold thing, where the underlying cause of this symptom was that the config wasn't being merged. So by making this change to make sure that the config merges in a more intelligent way, that gets the CLI tests passing, and just to double check again, gets the whole test suite passing. Cool. So let's, I like to use a GitHub app just to quickly review what my changes were. All right, so we don't have to skip the CLI test anymore because they pass, although I think I'll make that a separate commit so I can look at that in the history and find it if I ever need to. Basically, oh, see, this is why I like to do this, because I made a change to this file just to like demonstrate something when I was talking through the stream, and I actually don't want to keep this. So let's just discard that one. So this is fine. I mean, looking at it again, I do wonder if there's like a way to make that cooler. I feel like there's pressure on the spot here to get this right, or to think up a clever solution. But basically, I'm trying to think of a way where I can basically have an object where we have like theme, variance. Theme is going to be this. Variance is going to be this. And then I guess the defaults for the whole object. So if we were going to say like, I think this would actually work. Thankfully we have tests, right? So if I just return that, let's see, merge config. No? Oh, commas. Programming. We should probably do a prettier formatting thing too. Yeah, okay, that's cool. So we're going to use the config, the default config theme, the default config variance. Then we're going to throw the user, whatever the user specified, merge those in, and then at the end we'll do the default config. So now we've got like a one-liner essentially. It's 4 lines, but it's really 1 line. So that's kind of cool. So let's run the whole test suite. There's no chance of this broke or anything, but just to be sure. Okay, cool. All right, so that looks good. That looks good. So let's just say merge users config intelligently deep merge users config. That's kind of what we're trying to do. And here we can just say don't skip CLI tests. All right. Cool. All right, so that's that's a win. So we can check something off here. So we wrote tests for auto merging the theme key. So let's check that off. We wrote tests for auto merging the defaults or the modules key, which is actually the variance key. Oh man, what the heck? We fixed the CLI tests because this was all kind of one thing here. So now there's like some more interesting stuff we can do, like update the color related plugins to fallback to colors key and theme. There's another thing that I want to do here that I don't want to forget, which is rename config function to theme function. Possibly. I need to sort of think through if I want that to actually work that way. Cool. So I kind of want to do this where we create a default theme file, because if you look at what I had here, this is sort of how I'm thinking we're going to make it easy for people to extend the defaults, at least as a starting point. We'll basically let them import the defaults into their project and just merge it in. It's hard to, I might change my mind about this later, but I think it's probably good as a starting point. And I probably am not going to really have people ever publish this default config file anymore, which will be nice. This will be more of just like an internal thing. So I think we can do this as a refactoring without writing any tests. So why don't we just duplicate this file and we'll call it like default theme.js. One thing that kind of sucks about this stuff is I basically have to make this a function because I can't allow someone to edit it, you know, because the way that no modules work is if you just export an object, that's like a singleton throughout the whole project. So anytime you do a require statement on it again, you get the same reference back. So the only way for me to get a fresh copy of it that's safe for the user to sort of like edit is if I clone it before exporting it. So I wish I could think of a clever way in Node for someone to just require the default theme and have this be a fresh copy every time without making them call it as a function. I don't know. Maybe Google has an answer to that. Node require copy. Is this a thing? Node require module as copy. So I think this guy's going to just say use functions. Yeah, that's what I thought. Okay, so the answer is to just use a function, which I can live with that, I guess. We've been doing it up until now. Okay, so basically module.exports equals function. Move all this stuff up into that function. We still have to declare colors as a constant to reference it multiple times. Instead of this being module.exports, this is just going to be a return statement. Because this is the theme, we don't care about this stuff. We only care about what was going to be inside the theme. Grab everything here, pull that over. And I don't know, hopefully we can just look right. When you get these big objects, it's hard. Okay. We're not getting a matching brace highlight, which is a little scary, but maybe it's just because it's too big of an object. Let's just see what happens if we it's probably fine. Here in this default config file, why don't we at the top const default theme equals require / default theme and invoke that. Let's just run the tests and make sure that it doesn't blow up because like of a syntax error before we actually do a refactoring. Okay, it still works. So my hope now is that we can just find the theme section here. And as a simple first step, we'll just override it in the same object quickly so that we don't have to do all this deletion. And if that works, then we can delete the theme inside this file, which simplifies this file a little bit. Did I delete something I didn't mean to? Oh yeah, the variants. Okay, we need to keep the variants. We might export more of these like defaults into separate files eventually, because this is a little nasty looking still to have this big list. And someone might want to be able to reference the default variants, so we might have to think through that. Like you can already grab the default config anyways. I probably won't get rid of that. So now this file, we don't need all the colors defined. So now it's like 70 lines instead, which is kind of nice. Cool. This plugins thing, I haven't really thought through what I want to do for the container plugin yet. Now that I've refactored everything to be these like core plugins, container is weird because it is a built-in plugin, but it wasn't enabled in core. It was like a plugin that's included with Tailwind, but you consume it as if it's a third-party plugin. And I don't know if I want to keep doing that or if we should just bake it into the framework. I think it's like so commonly needed that maybe it's useful to have. And again, like there's nothing stopping someone from going like container false here to disable it. So I'll have to think that through, but for now, just kind of leave it as is. Make sure our tests are passing and cool. So now we can check that item off our list. One thing that's kind of annoying about these node packages is if you want to be able to have people use multiple files from your package, like so for example, if I just do like require Tailwind CSS, right? That's going to use whatever's specified in my package.json as like the main file. So it's going to go lib index, which is fine. But if you want people to be able to like grab other files from stuff, there's no way to sort of put those in any organized place. You literally have to put them in the project root. That's the only way for this to work, without someone else having to know the entire path. And maybe I'm wrong about that. So if someone knows another way to do that, that would be awesome. But when I was looking at like Lodash on GitHub, for example, I noticed that they have everything in the project root for what I assume is the same reason. And each one of these just literally, oh, actually, wow. I didn't realize that they actually put all the code in these. I thought all these were just like grabbing it from somewhere else, like just kind of proxying through to a different thing. But yeah, it feels like it sort of forces you to be a little bit unorganized. But it's okay. Can live with it. All right, so where are we at on this? Okay, so this is actually could be like kind of an interesting one. So I'll show you how this kind of currently works. If you look in source plugins, this is where all of Tailwind's built-in core plugins work. Built-in core plugins live. Jesus, can't even speak. So if you look at like background colors, for example, the background colors plugin, our plugins, we kind of design them with this internal API where they're functions that return functions. And the idea behind that is basically the first function takes the configuration for the plugin, and then what it returns is what Tailwind understands as the interface for a plugin. So like a plugin in Tailwind is just a function that Tailwind passes an object to that contains a bunch of helper functions that you can use to register classes with Tailwind. So for example, the simplest possible plugin that you could write would just look like a function that destructures add utilities and then just calls add utilities, passing through a JavaScript object with any utilities you want to add. So for example, you might add a class called like .foo that just sets like the color to blue. So that's a plugin. And if you look at like an actual Tailwind config file, literally all you have to do to make that work is just stick that function in this array. So the way that the Tailwind plugins that are built in work, because the idea is that you would like require a plugin here, right? Like you require like my plugin. If you just wrote it this way and returned this function, you'd have like no way of passing any configuration to the plugin because the plugin's argument list is sort of owned by Tailwind itself. So the solution to that is to have your plugins actually export a function like we do here that takes your own config, right? So this would be like my custom plugin configuration, you know? And then what this returns is the function that Tailwind knows about, but because they live in the same scope here, the contents of this function now have access to what was passed into the configuration. So you can see like we use values, for example, even though it comes in the parent scope. So all that to say, that's what a plugin looks like in Tailwind. It's as simple as I could possibly think to make it conceptually. So the way that the default plugins are loaded currently is if you look at the default, whoa, what am I doing? Oh, I renamed it to core plugins. So there's this core plugins file that imports all of Tailwind's plugins, and it basically just contains some logic to, based on the user's config file, loads up all those plugins, filters out any plugins that are disabled based on that core plugins thing that I kind of talked about before. Like if someone has core plugins, appearance false, for example, what this is going to do is it's going to see, okay, is core plugins for that key set to false? If so, we filter out that plugin. And then it just runs a map operation, grabbing each plugin from the array of plugins based on the key, because down here we're just basically as a shorthand for this, right? So we have the keys and the plugin itself. And then we, this returns a function. We invoke that function, passing through what is essentially the standard API for core Tailwind plugins. There's no reason this has to be standard. It's just like makes it easy for us to do all this in a simple way instead of everything having its own configuration. Might change down the road, but right now this is kind of how it works. So we explicitly pass in the values from the person's theme, and we explicitly pass in the variants that should be generated. And that's how it kind of works. So like right now, for example, background colors, it gets the colors directly. So there's a couple different ways that we could solve this problem where I want to basically be able to make it for color related plugins to fall back to the colors key in the theme. I have to make a decision about like where in the code that should happen. So one place that could happen is in this file. It would make this a lot more complex. Not that it would make this complex, actually. It would just mean that I would have to invoke each one of these plugins passing through their specific arguments, which isn't that crazy of a thing to do. But basically, you can imagine a scenario where I essentially have to return like a big array of plugins that are like loaded. And one of those plugins, you know, there's going to be some before it, some after it. But one of them is like the background colors plugin. And it takes this configuration, right? It takes like values, which normally we would say config.theme.background colors. And then it takes variants, which normally would be config.variants.background colors. And that's where we kind of get that information from. So one place that I could do this work is basically to say like _.get config.theme. From config get theme.background colors and fall back to config.theme.colors. Right, so I could just put it here where we try to grab the background colors if they're defined. If they're not defined, then we fall back to the colors. Another place we could do it, though, is in the plugin itself. So instead of doing it this way, we could just try to pass through the values. And one thing I need to understand, say we have like an object, and I said like foo at bar. Okay, so I get undefined. All right. So basically I could still pass through these values. It would come through as undefined into this plugin. And then here, I would basically just have to like override values. So here I could say like const background colors equals I never know, like I always rely on Lodash to do everything because I never know what gotchas there are in JavaScript, right? So you have this like is undefined. I don't know if this like what the code for this looks like. Yeah, so okay, so it is simple. It just does a triple equals undefined. I still kind of like doing it this way because it feels like I'm sort of insulated against like any weirdness. So if values is undefined, actually I would have to do it here. You also can get this config function from a plugin. So I could say const background colors equals is undefined values. Then we'll use config at theme.colors. And you know what? I'm kind of curious. If I look at process plugins, where we create the config function. Oh yeah, so you can do a default value here. Alrighty, so that's kind of interesting. That wouldn't work though. Okay, yeah, never mind. So if it is undefined, then fall back to theme.colors. Otherwise, use the values. And I bet you Prettier is going to want to make me do some bananas stuff. I don't know. We'll see. And then instead of going over values here, we'd map over the background colors. So this would be another way to do it, where basically I make the plugin responsible for grabbing the default values. Yeah, so that would work. Or I could do it in that core plugins file. And I guess what I'm trying to figure out in my head is which place makes more sense to do it. Yeah, the or thing probably would work. I kind of get a little nervous when I do something like that because I feel like, at least in PHP, it's always scary because like empty array is falsy, but I might want to use it as the actual value. So I try not to rely too much on like implied falsiness, but maybe it's a little bit less weird in JavaScript than it is in PHP. So anyways, I guess I'm just trying to figure out where I want to do this. If it makes more sense to do it from inside the plugin. And in some ways I think it does, because if you were going to write a third-party plugin that was going to fall back to a default config value, you would write it this way. where you put the logic inside the plugin. So maybe we will rely on doing it that way. The one thing I'm a little nervous about, and maybe I just need to solve this problem beforehand or afterwards, is if you look at the default theme and you look at like border colors is different than text colors and background colors because it adds in this default value because we want to be able to have default border colors. And I can't decide what to do here because the point of this is basically to make it so that when you say like div class equals just border and you just want to add a 1 pixel border by default, this is where it knows what color to use for that. And that sounds like reasonable enough, but the actual implementation of this is not intuitive at all. It's like not what you would expect. The way that it actually works is in our pre-flight styles. We have this crazy code here that resets every single element on the whole window, sets the border width to 0, sets the border style to solid, and sets the border color to the default border color. So the way that default border colors actually work in Tailwind, it's not that the border class adds a color, it's that the border class adds a width. So it just, anytime you say like class equals border, what you're really saying is class equals like border width 1 pixel, like if you were to expand what that actually means. And the only reason it happens to use the default border color is because we've done this reset style where we give every element the default border color by default. It works really well, but it makes me question whether our current setup for choosing the default border color is good or not. I think it's like I think it makes sense to the end user because it's like, okay, I'm going to specify like what the color should be when I just want to simply add the border class that belongs in border colors. But the funny thing about it is it literally has nothing to do with the border colors utilities at all. It is purely to do with border widths and pre-flight styles. So one thing I'm considering is making it so that in like your theme, there's like a pre-flight section for configuring the pre-flight plugin where we have like default border color here. And it's a little bit odd because it's like we're exposing implementation details to the user to make them, because it makes something simpler for us. And it's always hard to decide, like, is it beneficial for them to sort of realize more that how this is working? Or are we just like making things like less intuitive for them and making it like is it weird that, you know, they can't just say border colors default gray essentially? And I don't think I've explained this, but the whole reason that this decision matters is because in order to do this thing that we're doing in this background colors thing where we're falling back to the theme colors, I need to come up with a solution for this border colors thing, because the theme colors, if you look at the default theme where colors is specified or whatever, right? There's no default in here, you know? And border colors needs to add defaults to the list of colors. So if someone wants to change the default border color in the new config format, like the only way that they could do it, okay, so they could do something like border colors, and then they could say splat in the default theme colors, right? So they get all the colors, and then they could say default should be default theme dot colors gray light, right? This is like one way that they could do it. However, say that someone overrided all the colors, because that's very common in Tailwind to not use the default color scheme at all and use like your brand colors that your designer has given you. If you've done this Now border colors has no way to guess what the default should be, because it's going to like look for gray light by default maybe, but you don't have a gray light specified. So what do we do? I'm not sure. So that's one of the things that like makes me wonder, maybe moving that to pre-flight so that default border color is here makes more sense. But I guess maybe there's a similar problem where it's like, what does this default to if you've overridden the colors? I mean, we could just have it hard coded in. The border colors, I guess, could do the same thing. Like, I guess the other thing I'm trying to figure out is how do I do this in the most iterative way possible? Like, do I have to solve this pre-flight problem before I make the color merging thing happen? Or is there a way I can do the color merging and then when I figure this out, revisit how that works after the fact? So I guess what I'm trying to decide in my head right now is, would it be that bad if the border colors plugin was smart enough to default to just always used whatever gray light is from the default theme unless it was overridden? I mean, maybe that's not the long-term perfect solution, but I think it is like a good enough solution for now. And if someone's noticing that they're getting a border color that doesn't look like it matches their brand, well, it's because, yeah, we defaulted to the default thing. No, Tailwind 1.0 is not released. I'm working on it right now so that hopefully I can release it. I guess it's February now, so I was planning to release it in February. So my goal is still to get it out this month. Although that might be ambitious now because this whole config file thing took me 3 weeks to make a decision, and I still have to write updated documentation and stuff. So we'll see. Okay, so why don't we charge ahead under the assumption that the borders colors plugin will default to kind of baking the colors thing in itself. And if someone wants to override it, they'd have to override it here. So if someone's only color palette was pink, salmon color, their borders would still be Tailwind's default gray light by default. And I mean, we can make it intelligent and have it fall back to, if they have gray light override it in the colors, we'll use gray light, but otherwise yeah, I don't know. It's not the end of the world. I guess what I really want to figure out though is how I should test this. And I think the easiest way to test this, is probably going to be to write tests for the plugin. So that's something that I haven't done yet. None of the plugins have tests. We just kind of rely on like the sanity tests. And I don't really want to write sanity tests for this sort of thing. Like, that's insane. So, sanity, insane. So why don't I create a folder here called like plugins, or like core plugins maybe. And we'll write a new test file for, I'm going to copy this process plugins test as a starting point because it's probably got some useful stuff in it. And we'll call this like border colors. We'll just write this one first. Let's look at the GitHub and see what files I've messed up as I've just been like talking about doing stuff. Okay, so we won't commit that right now. We should commit this default theme stuff that we did. Did we make any other changes to this file besides that? Okay, so let's just commit extract default theme to separate file. And then we can work on this part. This is such a big something else I'm wondering right now is if I should PR the current stuff and make this a separate branch. Let's make a new branch either way. So we'll keep config restructuring. I kind of think config restructuring is like borderline done. So let's just check out color fallbacks as another branch. This is just a GitHub app. Yeah, GitHub desktop. Just out of curiosity, I wonder if we go to, if I was to make a pull request from config restructuring to the next branch, what do we get here? So you can see my first commit to this. Oh, what? This is 14 days ago, yeah. 126 files changed, 29,000 additions. Good grief, what am I? Where's that 29,000 coming from? Oh, it's probably this. That's probably, yeah, 28,000 just from a fixture, which is okay. It'd be nice if I could split that into a separate pull request. Let's think that through. I'm surprised that the CLI tests are in here. I was pretty sure that I merged that into... Oh, you know what I need to do? I need to stash, check out the next branch, actually check out the master branch, pull the master branch, make sure that's good, check out next, which is kind of like where I'm putting all the Tailwind 1.0 stuff, pull this, rebase it on top of master, I think. Check out config restructuring, rebase on top of next, push that. Delete the color fallbacks branch, check out a new color fallbacks branch, apply my stashed changes. And then I think if we refresh this, okay, so the one commit that I was hoping would disappear did disappear. Yeah. And then I just need to figure out if I can extract the changes about the important stuff. I don't even know when I did that. Yeah, so this sanity test, it's too bad that I didn't do that separately. Made a mess of things for myself. Okay, let's see if we can figure out how to write a test for this border color thing. It's going to be kind of interesting because we have to figure out, I don't really want to process the plugin, I don't think. Because I actually do kind of want to write this as more of like a unit level test and not really like do a ton of insane stuff. I think like all I really care about is I don't need post CSS or process plugins. Basically, I want to be able to take the border color plugin, right, which is going to be like import plugin from this is tests, this is root. One thing I can't remember is if I'm importing from source or not. Yeah, because the tests are getting Babelified somehow. I have no idea how any of this stuff works, by the way. I think David Hemphill helped me set it up originally. Like, how does test know to use the Babelified versions of the code? I have no idea. I literally have no idea why that works. Because it certainly doesn't look like it's calling Babel. Is it because there's like there's a Babel Jest plugin and that like automatically works, I guess? Seems fine. All right, so we'll get source, plugins, border colors. So basically we want to like call the plugin, passing through some options, and then we want to call it again, passing through like the plugin API functions. And then we want to like assert it worked. So I kind of have a bit of an idea, like for this one particularly, since if you look at border color, the only thing it does, and this is kind of interesting because this might inform some things that I do in the future. What friggin' file was it? Oh, it was a background colors file that we had edited. Okay, so let's just cut that line for a second. What's the difference in background colors now? I'm very confused. Okay, let's discard those changes. Okay, so if we look at the border colors plugin, I'm just gonna like paste in this code so we don't lose it temporarily. It's kind of stupid, but could have rewritten it. We're supposed to be test driving our code anyways. Basically what we need to do is I need to write some like basically like a fake version of the plugin API that I can pass in, that I can use to inspect kind of what happened, which will be kind of fun. So let's just try and do it in like the most simple way possible. So let's just write a test call that works for now, just so we can have like a playground for sort of scaffolding things. So the plugin options is going to be this, right? We're going to have like variants and values. So if we say we want like responsive, hover, and focus versions, and then let's like look at the default theme. I guess we'll grab colors and we'll just simplify it so we're only working with a reasonable amount. Maybe we'll keep like red, green, and blue. And maybe we'll only keep like a few of each. And maybe we'll keep what did I say the default was for border colors? Gray light. Okay, so as long as I keep the, maybe I'll just keep the light and dark versions of each one. So this is kind of like representative of a somewhat realistic invocation of this plugin. So the idea is basically going to be that we're going to want to call the plugin with its options, and then we're going to call the plugin with the plugin API functions. And I'm curious to see, okay, so it's expecting, the only thing it actually uses is add utilities and E right now. So let's look at process plugins and we can kind of copy those implementations. So E is really easy. It's just escape class name. So let's do like const plugin API, and we'll have to grab escape class name from wherever it comes from. And what I'll do is I'll end up extracting this out into like another like plugin helpers thing that we can reuse for testing other plugins, and that I could probably also use, like maybe I could even like make it a package so anyone who's writing plugins for Tailwind could test their plugins more easily. So we're gonna have the escape class name thing, which we might as well use the real version of that. And then we're gonna have add utilities, and this is gonna be a function that takes utilities. And this is where things are gonna get interesting, because basically I need to decide what logic to put here to be able to inspect this result after the fact. So my like naive idea here is to basically create like an array called utilities, like added utilities. And every time we call add utilities, basically we'll just say added utilities dot push utilities. And now at the end of the day, in theory, I should be able to log added utilities. And if we run this test, we should see that it added some utilities, as long as I didn't bork the whole thing up, which I might have. So let's run we'll do yarn jest plugins border. Can't find module escape class name, so I think I'm probably not going out deep enough. And we're not using Lodash yet, but Lodash should really be like the standard library in JavaScript. So I'm going to keep it anyways. Okay, options is not defined. That's okay. So we'll call this plugin options. I'm just going to inline it actually. Okay, let's see what we get. Yeah, okay. So it did give us our utilities. Excellent. I can never remember what expectations look like in Jest. I don't write these tests from scratch enough. I'm always like editing things. Okay, so I guess we just want to say expect added utilities to, I never know the difference, jest to be to equal. Just fucking say which one is by reference and which one is by value. Okay, to equal is probably what I care about here. Okay, so let's just run prettier on this. Oh, didn't work. Of course it didn't, because nothing ever works. Why would it work? Yarn, run, style, tests, plugins. Oops. Core plugins. Border colors. Okay. All right. Formatted. All right, so let's run this test now. Yarn run just core plugins border. Okay, cool. So we have an example of like a passing test, which is kind of nice. So this lets us basically just test the plugin logic. And then for other plugins, we're going to need to do the same thing with like add components or eventually the config function and stuff. But for now, this is kind of pretty good. So why don't we just have a test called it generates border color utilities. And I'm just going to commit this. What have we done? Default theme has changed in what way? Oh, prettier ran on everything. Okay. We won't do those changes. Okay. So we'll just add this one test for now. Test border colors. Add first test for border colors plugin. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to git add source plugins border colors git stash. I didn't mean to, I only wanted to stash what was added. Okay, that's fine. We'll go to the configure restructuring branch. Yarn run style fix. Okay, fix code style. Git push. Then we'll check out this colors branch again, and then we'll rebase that on top of the config branch. Let's apply our stash and see what, okay, so now we just have the one change, which is kind of what I wanted. So we'll do git upload. This is a custom git shortcut, so I can set the remote branch quickly. And now the only change we have is like this code that we kind of wrote for ourselves that we haven't actually applied yet. There's an extra space. Git add tests git commit dash dash amend force push. Okay. So let's write a test that says, I'm pretty happy with how this worked out, by the way. It feels nice and simple and isolated. So let's test. We're going to have to change the first test actually to probably after we do this. It uses the default gray light color for default borders by default. Default. Kind of blows that this plugin is going to have a dependency on the default theme, but I guess that's okay. I mean, again, it's one of those things where like there's worse things to be worried about, I guess, whatever. Okay, so let's just say we were only passing through red, green, and blue. Then our expectations would be that we'd get red, green, blue, and you know what I'm curious about? Okay, so we omit default. So here's the interesting thing about this whole default thing. This is even, I kind of forgot how this even worked. This kind of changes things. It doesn't actually create any classes for it. It literally just ignores it. So it's actually pre-flight that cares that there's a theme value called border colors default. So honestly, that makes some of this even easier. I'm still glad we have this test though. So why don't we just like simplify this anyways? Because now that I realize that I don't care about the gray light thing, let's just make this red, green, blue. So we have less noise. And what we actually want to say here, it ignores the default border color. So basically if we had like a default value with this, the idea is that it gets excluded. Like that's what the actual test is here. Oh, you know what else we need to test? We need to test the if the variants are right. So the variance, I think, is passed as a second argument to add utilities. So our add utilities kind of helper function, it needs to accept an argument called variance. So added utilities, I think we're going to push an object onto it now instead. And it'll have like utilities and variance. This will kind of let us inspect both. So we're going to expect added utilities to equal utilities. And this will be an object. And variance for that object is going to be this. And then we'll do the same thing down here. I'm so annoyed that this Sublime Prettier plugin isn't working. Okay, let's just see. Yarn run just core plugins border. What? Oh. Okay, so that's working. If I was to change this to poop, it should fail. Yeah, okay. All right. And let's just say it generates border color utilities with the specified variance. So the only difference here is I'm just going to change variance just so that the test proves that the variants aren't hard coded into the test, essentially. Actually, I don't care about that, because otherwise I would do the same thing for colors. And that would be a stupid way to write the code, so. Yeah, seems pretty good. Okay, so let's see what we got. So this can actually just be discarded. So really all we did was add tests for something that already worked, which actually, you know what? We need to add tests for falling back to the colors key. What am I talking about? I'm so stupid. All right. It ignores the default border color. Test that border colors plugin ignores the default border color. Okay, so let's add the test that we actually came here to write from the beginning, because I'm brain dead and forgot that how this should work. Okay, so it uses the themes color palette if no border colors are provided. Picked up on that little apostrophe trick that someone mentioned in chat. Thanks to whoever suggested that. Actually, I'm just going to say theme color palette because it still feels weird. Okay, so the idea now is going to be that we're going to have to provide a config function here. And if we look at how it works here, we'll just make it kind of simulate the real one. So it's a function that takes a path and a default value and returns underscore grabbing the config path default value. So here we can just like hard code in the thing that we want it to be able to have access to, which in this case is going to be colors. And we use different colors this time. Maybe like teal, blue, and indigo or something. Or like teal, indigo, and orange. Okay. So the idea here is that when we pass in no values, or values as undefined, that what we should get is, that didn't work, did it? Whatever, just type them. No, I refuse. I'll show you how this works. Copy that. Whoa. And then we'll grab these ones. All right, let's run the same test again. Should fail because we haven't actually implemented this yet. Okay, so we got an empty object instead of something useful. So here we basically just want to bring this code back. Border colors, we're going to grab theme colors. Now, okay, so there is something about this where we do need, oh no, we still don't really need to care about the default thing here. Okay. One thing I don't know if I love about the way that this all works at all anyways, is we make it impossible for someone to create a class called border default, which seems like kind of an unnecessarily harsh opinion to have. But again, that's something that I think I have to revisit after I get this part working and not just in the middle of this. Config is not defined. Okay, let's destructure config. The other tests are going to pass because, or are going to fail, I would have thought. Oh, we got to nest this under theme. And passing. Cool. So let's run yarn style fix to clean up our code and kind of check out what we got here. I think I'll do that cleanup as a separate commit actually. So we'll just uncheck it here. Something I'm actually surprised by is that oh, this doesn't get called because values isn't undefined. Okay, I mean, it's fine. In a perfect world, though, I probably should be passing through the config function everywhere. I kind of feel like I should pass it through anyways. And we'll just make it return null no matter what, just like a kind of a no-op function for now, because these ones don't need it. And then for like the generalized solution, when I want to build something that other people can use for their own plugins, then I'll make it a little bit more robust. Okay, so we just won't commit that stuff. We'll just commit the stuff sort of related to this first change. Yes, we'll say test that border colors falls back to theme colors. And then we'll just fix like code style basically as a separate commit. Fix code style. Cool. And if we push that, good to go. Whoa. Let's run the whole thing just to be sure. Uh-oh. Shit. Oh, what the fuck? I swear that got updated in the... Someone submitted a PR that removed something from pre-flight. And I swear that they updated the tests for it. Oh, they didn't. Oh, no, they did. So then why on earth does my Tailwind output... It's probably a different test. I probably have to go to this one. Okay. I should do that on the... it's annoying. It's all related to that extra test I added for generating things with like the important output. Okay, whatever. I'm just going to reset, check out the config restructuring branch, and do that here, because that should be failing too, actually. But it should be passing now. Okay, push. Get rebase config restructuring. Run the tests again. Force push. Cool. All right. I think that's probably all I'm going to stream this morning. Probably take a break and have some lunch. And then I'll probably write some tests for these other border color or for the background color and text color plugins. But yeah, hopefully this was kind of fun. Hopefully you learned a little bit about how kind of Tailwind works internally in some ways and stuff. So thanks to everyone for checking out the stream, and maybe I'll do some more of these if you liked it. So let me know if you enjoyed just kind of watching me work on this stuff versus my normal streams where usually we're doing something that's maybe a bit more almost presentational-ish. But if you thought this was fun, then I would be happy to do more this style, because it's kind of a good way for me to get some real work done while kind of streaming stuff for people to check out at the same time. All right, everyone. See you later.